Now, we've gone through tool set, we've gone through skill set, we're at that third set, that all-important mindset of an entrepreneur. What is the mindset of a Silicon Valley or a San Francisco entrepreneur, or a great entrepreneur anywhere in the world? Well, we've already asked the question, what is an entrepreneur? And we've provided some good examples. Here's an example of Richard Branson of Virgin everything fame, right? Virgin Records, Virgin Air, Virgin Cola. He's been an entrepreneur many times over. Now, I want you to think about somebody like Richard Branson or Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook or Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, or fill in with your favorite entrepreneurs. Think about who they are and what they've done, and now think about their mindset. And we want to try and get into what that entrepreneurial mindset is. What do they think about? How do they act? If you were asked to describe an entrepreneur, what words would you use? So what I'd like you to do would be to take a couple of minutes right now and put this lesson on pause and write down as many phrases as you might think about. It could be risk-taking, it could be whatever. I want you to think about those phrases and write them down, and then when you've got that list, come back and I'm going to share with you 10 of my favorite traits of entrepreneurs. All right, this is my 10 traits of an entrepreneur anywhere in the world. And you may have different ones, but let's start with these, shall we? Number 1, an entrepreneur has a bias to action, not a bias to planning. It's that bias we talked about. Jump out of the airplane, learn, talk to customers, get an early prototype out there, move quickly. Number 2, entrepreneurs not only welcome change, because change creates opportunities. Changes in laws, changes in technologies, changes in trends and fashion create new opportunities, but they go out and they create change. The entrepreneurs are the ones that make new industries happen. Number 3, entrepreneurs focus on what really matters. Oftentimes we get caught up in responding to all those emails, in getting that report done that we know we need to get done for our colleague or our boss. Entrepreneurs to us sometimes will say important or urgent, but not the most important, and they focus on what really matters, getting that product to marketplace, getting that meeting with those first 3 customers or investors. Focus on what matters. Number 4, entrepreneurs are fundamentally optimistic, because tomorrow is going to be a better day, because tomorrow we will ship that product, because tomorrow we will sell 100 units, and they capture other people's imagination with their optimism. That's how they attract resources, customers, teams, and all these other elements that help create the future winning businesses. Number 5, of course they're resourceful. An entrepreneur will find a way to get it done without that extra money, without the extra time, without the people. You figure out what you need and you create opportunities with limited resources. Number 6, entrepreneurs are fundamentally failure savvy. What does that mean? Now, we're going to spend another session on this right after this, but it means that they learn from their failures, that when a failure happens, they pause, they say, why didn't that work the way I expected it to? Or what just happened that I missed? Because inside those failures are very often the answers that you're seeking, if, as opposed to brushing them under the rug and saying, I don't want to deal with it, you take it apart and you look for what just happened and why did it happen. Number 7, of course entrepreneurs are resilient. Knock me down, I'm going to get right back up again. I'm going to get up another time and another time. They find reasons to continue to persevere, to go after their goals, and they bring other people with them on that journey. Number 8, entrepreneurs are intensely curious. Do you ever wonder, sometimes you sit down with somebody and they want to know everything about your job. about the challenges you face, about the products you sell, about how you think about your customers. And you know what they've just done? Well, first of all, it's been a wonderful conversation for you, right? But secondly, they've also learned a huge amount. And what do entrepreneurs do with that information? They always put it to work. They store that information and they pull it back out again when they need it because they're learning something every day. They're reading voraciously. They're talking to people and incredibly inquisitive. Number 9, entrepreneurs know their customer. They are out talking to customers all the time. They are trying to understand what problems customers are trying to solve and how they solve them now and how they'd like to solve them differently, potentially in the future. And finally, number 10, entrepreneurs don't always ask for permission. In fact, they rarely ask for permission because they're going to break the status quo. They ask for forgiveness after they've done that. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Those are my top 10 mindset attributes of entrepreneurs. How did you do? In this next section, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're still going to focus on what helps drive innovation, what drives effective entrepreneurship. And we're going to look at it, though, from a different angle. We're going to take a look and say, what other resources might we be able to incorporate to help drive that next innovation, that new venture that we're thinking about? And one resource that typically has been overlooked is this resource of failure. As I shared with you earlier, I wrote a book about this, which was published recently. It's called The Other F Word: How Smart Leaders, Teams, and Entrepreneurs Put Failure to Work. And our impetus for writing this book, why did we write the book, is we noticed, as I've shared with you during this particular lesson, that the way that we think about and teach entrepreneurship and innovation has changed. It's become far faster. It's become far more iterative. The approaches that we take incorporate a broad variety of inputs in real time to be able to help understand what works and what doesn't work. And when something doesn't work, smart entrepreneurs, smart innovators take insights from that particular failure or mistake or bad outcome, negative outcome, assess it and roll it into more successful opportunities in the future. Now, what we noticed here in the San Francisco Bay Area is as this practice around entrepreneurship and innovation was shifting, people were starting to pay much more attention to those outcomes from failure. As many people observe, Silicon Valley is one of those few places where it's okay to fail. And it's okay to fail not just once or twice, but multiple times, as long as you're able to take learnings from that failure and put it to work. In fact, when entrepreneurs recruit other entrepreneurs or team members, they often ask, what have you failed at and what did you learn from that failure? So I've observed this up close and personal for many years. But the other thing that I've observed is once I get outside of this region and I start talking about how we can better leverage failure to business executives in large global enterprises or internationally to executives in organizations around the world, this willingness to leverage failure, to embrace failure as a strategic resource, is very different. And that's why John and I wrote this book. We wanted to be able to share our experiences and insights, to share the experiences and outcomes of hundreds of companies and entrepreneurs which were involved in the research that we did for this book, to others around the world to say, here's another resource that you need to leverage, and that resource is failure. Now let's start this discussion with a recognition that failure happens a lot. Failure happens far more often than success, including in many areas where you would expect success rates to be much higher. Quickly walk down this list. Michael Jordan, arguably one of the best basketball players or the greatest basketball players of all time, although I'll say our Golden State Warriors with Steph Curry is doing pretty darn well these days, missed more field goals than he made throughout his career. VC-funded startups, if you move up to the green line, 75% of startups that attract venture capital, which means that they are the most vetted of these startups, fail to return even the amount of money that's invested in them to their investors. 3 out of 4 fail that fundamentally. Do you do New Year's resolutions? Do you make those New Year's resolutions? Well, 88% of New Year's resolutions fail. It's one of the reasons why we get to make New Year's resolutions every year. And how about patents? Here in the United States, 99 out of 100 patents fail to create value, fail to generate revenues or income for their patent owners. So failure is much more prevalent than success across so many of these different arenas. In fact, during the Second World War, the U.S. Army came up with their own term for this. And you may know this word. It's called snafu, which means something is just not going right. But it's actually an acronym. And it's an acronym for the other F word. It's situation normal, all fucked up. Now, how does failure insinuate itself? How does it put itself to work? Well, one of the ways that we look at this is if I'm an entrepreneur and I am investigating a new marketplace, if I am looking to disrupt the status quo, I'm going to take a look to see which incumbents are not innovating fast enough, are not seeing the next trend, are not adopting new technologies or fads. So that's why we like to say, when I say we, I'm talking about John and me, your screw up became my startup. Let's look at an example. I was an executive at Sony for many years during the 1990s when Sony was one of, if not the preeminent brand in consumer electronics, probably where Apple is today. And Sony, of course, invented the Sony Walkman, invented the personal listening system, and then they went on to evolve it to the Sony Discman with CDs and others. Now, you would think that not only did Sony invent the Walkman and personal listening systems, they also owned a record company. Sony Music is Epic and Columbia Records. That as the state of the art evolved from analog to digital, Sony would, of course, create that next generation personal listening system, right? Well, they didn't. What did they screw up that enabled Apple to then take that market by storm and not just take Sony's position in personal music systems, but really that was a changing of the guard between the old grand electronics preeminent brand and the next one being Apple. So what happened? Sony missed this transition from analog to digital. What they really missed was creating an easy to use and an easy to understand consumer experience. Apple, which really wasn't in any of these businesses beforehand, got the personal experience, the customer experience right, and was able to create this first generation Walkman, which then propelled it into all of the consumer devices that it currently is in and dominates on a global scale. The other way that we like to look at failure is to say that my startup is going to screw up before it grows up. And that talks to this iteration around learning from failure that we see so often here in Silicon Valley. For those of you that have read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, which was a lot of work that came out of UC Berkeley, by the way, including from my other UC Berkeley colleague, Steve Blank, this is often known as the pivot. Something isn't working right, you garner the right insights, and you pivot to a different product or a different business model. Now here's a company, Bourbon, that had attracted some of the top investors in Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area, including money from Andreessen Horowitz, which is a top venture capital firm that has been behind many of the huge hits in Silicon Valley. And Bourbon had created a product that was a mobile application that was kind of a Swiss Army knife, if you will, of mobile applications. It had some online commerce, it had some gaming, it had some social media, and it also had some photography features. And it was really intended to be your one-stop, the only app that you might need in your phone. And when the backers of Bourbon, when the founders of Bourbon went out to their customers, their beta customers that had been working on this for a while, and asked their beta customers what they thought, what do you think those customers said about this product? Well, the customers said it sucked. They didn't like the product. It did a lot of things, but it did most of them poorly, or at least it did most of them not as well as many of the other apps that were proliferating on the Android platform and the iPhone. So the founders of Bourbon were about to shut down this particular product until they heard one thing consistently. In the midst of all this failure, the founders of Bourbon heard just enough around this one feature they had that customers liked. And it was a simple photo feature that tied in with social media. So what those founders did is they decided to scrap all of those other features and focus on this one particular feature. And that feature just happened to be Instagram, which quickly became one of the most successful apps ever launched on the Apple Store, on the Apple platform, and then again on the Android platform. And within not many months, Instagram was bought by Facebook for $1 billion or more, depending upon how you do the math. What's been interesting on top of that is since that acquisition a number of years ago, Instagram has continued to be the fastest growing feature on Facebook. So clearly, those founders of Bourbon that listened for that nugget of wisdom inside their failure were onto something and created something of phenomenal value. Now, sometime, instead of pivoting, what you might want to do is rivet. You may want to persevere. Here's an example of a company that did just that. How many of you have this particular product at home? Is it this product? Or perhaps it's this product? Well, let me tell you the story about WD-40. And it goes back quite a ways. In the early 1950s, the Rocket Chemical Company was looking to create a new lubricant that would also act as a rust inhibitor because they worked with early generation rocket companies. And they started building a product around this water displacement formula. Water displacement formula number 1 was their first product, WD-1. Well, that didn't quite work. So they created WD-2, and then WD-3, and then WD-4, and you get the idea. They iterated through this product line 40 times until they created WD-40, which has continued largely unchanged to become one of the most durable and successful consumer products. Now, these are just 2 examples out of many different examples. When I come back, we'll talk about the failure value cycle that John and I developed on how you can explicitly leverage failure and turn it from a regret into a strategic resource. Here's a quick recap of our failure value cycle. Respect failure because it's all around us and it happens a lot. Rehearse, especially those failures that may happen the most often or those that may be those existential threats to the company. Put in place systems to help you recognize failure as early as possible. And then when a failure hits, react appropriately in the moment, and oftentimes that involves leadership. Apologize as appropriate or if needed, and resist the temptation to try and fix the problem right away. Because you can move on in our fifth stage and reflect and learn from what just happened. What were the insights that you can gain from that you then put to work in number 6, the rebound stage, where you deploy the resources of the company to maybe recover, but perhaps more importantly, to move in a different direction to own a new marketplace. And number 7, remember the failures and remember the learnings from those failures. There's one company, there are many companies, but there's one company that we do a lot of work with, that I do a lot of work with, that does a wonderful job respecting failure, and that's Google. As we've seen, for example, look at Google Glass, which may be back and may not. We'll see what happens. And many others. Orkut, the social media site that they recently closed after it was one of the largest sites, especially in South America. Google is not afraid to recognize its failures, to close down business units, but then what does Google do? Google redeploys those people into other areas of the company so that knowledge is not lost, but more importantly, that knowledge is leveraged, and they work hard to redeploy those individuals into areas that are facing similar problems. Google also recognized recently that as successful as it is with its search engine business, which it's built over the last 15 plus years, 15 years from now, it's likely that the search engine business is not going to be delivering the types of profitability that it currently does. So it's been investigating other areas ranging from self-driving cars to space exploration to medical devices and many more. But the operating rules for these exploratory in-development businesses are fundamentally different from those of a well-established, hugely profitable business like Google Search. So what did they do? In a really wonderful way of respecting the fact that failure will happen to them in the way it's happened to so many other companies like Kodak cameras, for example, and their inability to transition from analog, paper-based print technology, film technology, to digital. Google has split the company, keeping its search business in one area, focusing on operations, and its new development businesses in another. Ultimate respect for failure. Now, when a failure happens, how does your organization react? I would suggest there's 3 areas where we want to take a look. Number 1, it's the questions we ask. When a failure happens, what's the first question we hear? Is it, whose fault was it? Oftentimes that's the case. Think about what that does. What if we ask instead, what just happened? Why did it happen? How, where, whatever questions we would ask around that. And then once we've established that, then say, who was involved? What do they know? And how can we leverage their insights for us to recover, for us to learn from this? The second thing is, what stories can we tell from this? Think about the story, for example, at the Rocket Chemical Company about WD1, WD2, WD3 until they got to WD40. There's a company where failure is a recognized element of ultimate success, as long as we can build upon those prior failures. And sometimes it's also important to have relics, to have memories of that. let's look at Rocket Chemical again. Wouldn't it be great if you walked into their offices and there was a case filled with WD1, WD2, and WD3 reminding everyone about the iteration and how they ultimately arrived at this phenomenally successful product. Another thing to think about is how you might look at failure zones. You know, this book is not all about embracing failure broadly. We recognize that there are places and organizations where failure really is not an option. If you are a pharmaceutical manufacturing company, for example, that manufacturing line is not where you want failure to happen. If you are a power company running a nuclear power plant, same thing. If you're a bank, you do not want failure in your transactions processing and funds transfers. But if you're a bank, you may want to encourage experimentation and exploration in new areas like new product development or marketing. So if you think about your failure zones, think about the areas where, number one, the no-fail zones, where failure is not an option. But then we may have some areas where some failure is allowed. And then let's look at some other areas that would be those where we fail more often. Because if we're not failing somewhat in the creation of new products, in our marketing and branding campaigns, then we're not trying hard enough. We're not changing the status quo enough. And that means our competitors are going to be outflanking us. So think about your portfolio of failure zones. Next, and since I teach a lot of MBAs, this is a challenge. Don't always think like an MBA. Think like an engineer. Entire disciplines around failure analysis. Think like a writer or a filmmaker, where rough drafts are the name of the game until you iterate and get it right. Think like a scientist and this whole concept of the scientific method and experimentations. Because in the language of business, you have projects which succeed or fail. In these other disciplines, we learn from those, we focus on those, and we create success out of those failures, out of those negative outcomes. I was recently at Ford Motor Company's innovation lab in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, and I came across this room with this saying that was painted on the wall, which I loved. Failure is simply an opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. And who said that? The founder of the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, more than 100 years ago.